On the screen, Alan Feng was the very image of light. But it was precisely his death that exposed the darkness that no one dared to name. Alan Feng, whose presence seemed to float between subtlety and serenity, had conquered millions with an almost ethereal elegance. His career, marked by delicate gestures and a quiet beauty, projected the image of an untouchable artist, protected by a glow that never faded. However, when the news of his passing was made public, that brilliance shattered abruptly, leaving exposed a shadow that expanded rapidly. What should have been an intimate and respectful mourning transformed into a disturbing void, a space where the absence of answers seemed to carry more weight than the tragedy itself. 2 months later, the mystery continues suspended in the air, permeating every conversation, every speculation, and every attempt to reconstruct the actor's final days. The official silence, far from calming the public, acted as a catalyst. In an industry where visibility is currency and control is an unwritten rule, the lack of clarity became fertile ground for theories that grew without containment. In the midst of this storm emerged another name, one that already belonged to the pantheon of the country's most influential stars, Yang Mi. Admired for her discipline, her artistic solvency, and her magnetic presence, the actress found herself enveloped without warning in the same web of uncertainty that surrounded Fang. Conjectures arose immediately. Some claimed she was hospitalized. Others assured that she had fled abroad to escape an invisible danger. No version was confirmed, but in an atmosphere saturated with suspicion, mere doubt became sufficient fuel. Everything exploded when, from an unexpected corner of the world, a British medium stated in a live video that a famous actress was at risk and that a man was trapped by forces he could not see. Her words, wrapped in a tone that oscillated between warning and prophecy, crossed digital borders at a surprising speed. Suddenly, the story ceased to belong solely to the realm of Chinese entertainment and became a global conversation. Between the grief, the confusion, and the fear, the public began to wonder what could be hidden beneath the shine of a system that appeared perfect from the outside. Then emerged the question that changed everything. What mechanisms, hidden behind the lights and the applause, really drive this crisis? But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. Because when the truth remains trapped between censorship and conjecture, the mystery ceases to be a simple enigma. It becomes a mirror that reveals the cracks of an entire system. And it is precisely in that mirror where we will begin our analysis. The story surrounding Alan Fang is rooted in a context where fame and control advance hand in hand, forming a rigid structure that silently envelops those who find themselves under its lights. Before his name became a symbol of mystery, Fang was considered a disciplined, reserved artist deeply committed to his work. His presence on screen transmitted an almost ritualistic calm, a natural mastery that seemed to be born from an inner balance. However, behind this serenity emerged a much more inflexible professional environment, where every decision was conditioned by meticulous contracts and inescapable expectations that defined even the smallest gesture of a performer. The system that regulates the entertainment industry in China possesses a reputation as brilliant as it is feared. The agencies that manage the public lives of artists do so with a precision that borders on ownership. Work schedules are determined in advance, public interactions are planned in a calculated manner, and personal relationships, even those that barely touch the private sphere, are handled with caution to protect carefully constructed narratives. This panorama, which for some may seem like a natural part of the spectacle, encloses a constant tension that forces artists to live between obedience and the fear of displeasing those who possess the power to mold their careers. For Fang, this balance began to crumble months before his passing. His public appearances inexplicably diminished. Some projects that seemed to be in an advanced phase were cancelled without any explanation. Social networks, which used to be a stable window towards his followers, remained submerged in a silence that gradually became disturbing. The absence of official statements fueled the perception that something deeper was occurring, an internal process that could not be described but which made itself felt in every absence. In this scenario appears the figure of Yang Mi, one of the most influential artists of her generation. Her trajectory, marked by constancy and the ability to balance her facets as actress and producer, awakened a mixture of admiration and respect. However, her professional relationship with Fang seemed to be surrounded by insurmountable obstacles. 3 attempts to collaborate, 3 projects fallen for reasons that were never fully clarified. The public wondered if that was the fruit of chance, or if there existed a silent force preventing both from coinciding on screen. In an environment where coincidences are scarce, the repetition of events began to acquire a symbolic, almost premonitory nuance. Speculation, in these cases, is not a whim of the public, but a direct consequence of opacity. When the institutions in charge of offering clarity withdraw behind a wall of silence, alternative interpretations appear, constructed at the intersection between collective fear and the human need to understand what is hidden. Thus arose the idea that Fang was attempting to disassociate himself from his agency, a decision as complex as it is risky. The consequences of challenging such ferro structures usually extend beyond the visible, affecting not only the artist's career, but also their emotional and physical well-being. While this climate of uncertainty intensified, the public began to detect signals that, in isolation, could be considered trivial, but which together formed a disturbing pattern. Accounts of tense meetings, discrepancies regarding the direction of certain projects, or inexplicable delays in the publication of promotional material began to take on a different meaning. The public interpreted these signals as fragments of an internal conflict that was being carefully hidden. The unspoken acquired a weight that no official declaration could have counteracted. As the tension grew, it became evident that Fang's story transcended his individual figure. His experiences transformed into a reflection of the difficulties faced by those who attempt to reclaim a minimum of control in an environment where autonomy is not a right, but an exception. The industry had built an ecosystem where artistic freedom submitted to corporate convenience and where public identity was molded by foreign hands. Fang, who on screen seemed to float in a world of harmony, was dragged by a framework of invisible disputes that ended up enveloping his life in a halo of uncertainty. This was the terrain where theories began to germinate. The absence of clear answers not only fueled the public's imagination, but triggered a type of collective narrative that functions as a defense mechanism against the void. The interpretations did not arise out of morbid curiosity, but out of necessity. When the truth remains inaccessible, society creates stories that fill that space, granting meaning to the incomprehensible. At this point, the figure of young me resurged as a symbol of what the public feared and, at the same time, desired to understand. Her silence, interpreted by some as caution and by others as a sign of danger, was adopted as part of the mystery. Every absence of hers, every lack of update on her social networks increased the sensation that something was occurring on a plane that no one could see. Her failed attempts to collaborate with Fang were reinterpreted, becoming pieces of a puzzle that seemed to demand a deeper reading than was initially thought. The question that arose then was not only what had happened to Fang, but what all these accumulated silences meant. Was it possible that every absence, every omission, and every contained gesture revealed a systemic tension? Or was it simply the reflection of a public desperately seeking answers? What do you think of this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The media storm that was unleashed following the death of Alan Fang was not born within the borders in which his career was built. It surged from a remote, almost improbable point, when a British medium appeared in a nocturnal live stream stating that a famous actress was in danger and that a man found himself trapped by forces that escaped human comprehension. Her words, pronounced with a mixture of fragility and solemnity, pierced the screen with an unexpected intensity. Initially, they seemed like barely a whisper lost in the immensity of the internet. However, in a matter of hours, they became the epicenter of an earthquake that reached millions of devices around the world. Social networks reacted as if they had been waiting for a spark to light a fire. Fragments of the video began to circulate uncontrollably. Anonymous users added improvised subtitles. Others translated the broadcast into different languages, and some more began to elaborate interpretations that multiplied without restraint. In these first hours, the lack of precision was substituted by a tone of urgency that invited one to imagine that behind every phrase there was a hidden message. The name of young me emerged as a coincidence too perfect to go unnoticed. The medium's description seemed to coincide with her public figure, and that supposed correspondence was enough to activate a current of speculation that expanded without opposition. On platforms like Weibo, discussions surged and disappeared with disturbing rapidity. Posts that attempted to reconstruct timelines were eliminated almost instantly, leaving in their place a digital trail that for many became evidence that something was being attempted to be hidden. Censorship, instead of containing the phenomenon, fueled it. Every deleted message gave origin to 10 more. Every shared screenshot became a piece of digital contraband that crossed continents. The narrative no longer belonged solely to the users, but to the echo that the absence of answers provoked. The phenomenon reached a new dimension when the story crossed the digital wall. On Twitter and YouTube, foreign creators began to analyze the medium's transmission, trying to link her statements with rumors that had been circulating for weeks about Fang. The story ceased to be local, to transform into a global tale, fed by a collective desire to understand what seemed inaccessible. The speed of the exchange converted every theory into a platform for new interpretations, generating an endless loop in which information and fiction mixed without clear borders. As the conversation grew, international attention converted the details of the case into symbols. In Los Angeles, a group of film students gathered in front of the Walk of Fame, holding placards with Fang's face illuminated by digital candles. In New York, a screen in Times Square projected his image accompanied by the phrase, "The truth does not die," generating a moment of collective silence among those passing through the plaza. These acts, which in appearance had no direct relationship with the investigation, transformed into rituals of resistance against oblivion and indifference. The global reaction created a notable contrast between the international noise and the institutional silence. Official media, far from clarifying the facts, adopted a hermetic posture that fed suspicions even more. Lacking confirmations, the public began to interpret the absence of answers as an answer in itself. The narrative shifted from the plane of verifiable facts toward a territory where emotions dominated the conversation and where logic yielded to the impulse to protect a threatened memory. In this saturated environment appeared a second medium, known simply as Deborah, who added another layer to the tale when she stated that an actress had attempted to rescue a colleague held against his will. According to her, this woman had been transferred to a secret facility designated as Room 48. Her words, although impossible to verify, were integrated immediately into the set of beliefs that were already circulating. Users of different platforms began to analyze accents, poses, and metaphors, looking for signals that would justify the inclusion of this new variable in the puzzle. The story had become a living organism that absorbed every fragment and transformed it into part of its structure. Meanwhile, young Mi's prolonged absence in public acts began to be interpreted as proof that the narrative was closer to reality than many imagined. Her silence, which in ordinary contexts would have gone unnoticed, acquired an ominous character. The expectation for a public appearance grew every day, but no new image surfaced, which amplified the idea that the actress found herself trapped in a situation that no one could describe. Every day without updates was read as an indication that the story was heading toward a point of no return. The public divided into two clearly defined groups. One sector affirmed that the revelations of the mediums constituted metaphors that described hidden realities of the industry, oppressive contracts, silent reprisals, or practices that remained in the shadows. For them, the supernatural tale was the only way to say what could not be enunciated openly. The other sector, more skeptical, maintained that it was an emotional phenomenon, exacerbated by misinformation. However, both coincided on a fundamental idea. The story had escaped the logical realm and had installed itself in a territory where every symbol acquired weight. To the extent that tension increased, the speed of the conversation surpassed any attempt at containment. Captured screens, unverified documents, and decontextualized fragments were shared by millions, constructing a kind of collective mural where every added piece seemed to confirm the previous one. What began as an individual tragedy transformed into a reflection of contemporary anxieties regarding transparency, freedom of expression, and the limits of power in a hyper-connected world. The media avalanche not only amplified the story, but stripped it of its initial dimension. Fang ceased to be solely a young actor whose life ended abruptly. His figure became a symbol that condensed the fear of censorship and the need to be heard. The shadow surrounding Yang Mi was also not limited to a rumor about her whereabouts. It represented the collective fear that forced silence would impose itself over any attempt at truth. And in the middle of this emotional chaos, the lines separating reality from interpretation became thinner than ever. The intensity of the case reached its most critical point when rumors began to surface about the disappearance of Allen Fang's mother. Until then, the conversation had centered on the figure of the actor, on his interrupted trajectory, and on the uncertainty enveloping his destiny. However, the possibility that a member of his family had suffered a similar fate transformed the story completely. What was before a narrative about an uncomfortable silence became a shadow that seemed to advance beyond the limits of individual tragedy. The alleged disappearance installed a deep fear, the suspicion that any attempt to seek justice could carry a risk as high as the truth itself. The news was not confirmed by any official media outlet. Digital platforms, largely filled with posts claiming that the woman had been transferred to an undisclosed location, while others assured that she had passed away in circumstances that no one dared to describe openly. The British medium, whose initial transmission had triggered the expansion of the case, intervened again, insinuating that she had crossed to the other side. Her statement, loaded with an almost ritualistic dramatism, was interpreted by many as an omen that bordered on the inevitable. What is certain is that, in that moment, even those who maintained distance regarding the supernatural narrative felt that something broke definitively. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not the habitual silence that accompanies unverified information, but one that seemed to consume public conversation. Posts disappeared with greater speed. Discussions were cut short mid-sentence. Some users who attempted to organize informal chronologies ceased to appear. For the first time since the beginning of the storm, there was a sensation of collective exhaustion. The tension had reached a level that made every shared word seem like a transgression. The audience, which up to that point had participated with fervor, experienced an abrupt halt, as if everyone had simultaneously understood that the tale had touched a threshold that was too dark. However, that very silence prepared the ground for an unexpected change. When the initial commotion attenuated, signs of reorganization began to emerge among those who resisted letting the story fade away. Independent bloggers, who some time ago had documented the evolution of the case despite restrictions, began to compile deleted files, screenshots saved on external servers, fragments of videos downloaded before their elimination, conversations rescued from forums that had been shut down. This dispersed but persistent effort created the sensation that there existed a silent movement refusing to yield before the absence of answers. The most influential figure of this new phase was Lin Beishuan, a blogger known for his analytical tone and his insistence on questioning the official version of events from the first days. His momentary disappearance generated fear among his followers, who feared his voice had been silenced definitively. However, he reappeared a week later with a brief message. The truth has not disappeared. It only waits for someone to find the courage to pronounce it. That phrase of a shuddering simplicity expanded with a rapidity that could not be contained. In a matter of hours, it was translated into multiple languages, shared on countless platforms, and converted into the emotional epicenter of the case. This rebirth of interest marked the beginning of the narrative climax. Groups of activists abroad began to organize symbolic interventions, projecting Fang's face on buildings of consulates and museums, accompanying it with words that appealed to memory and justice. In Seoul, a collective of film students presented a performance piece titled Room 48, inspired by the testimony of the second medium. Although the work did not offer concrete answers, it captured the atmosphere of oppression that many perceived in the story. Fiction became a refuge where the truth could be insinuated without being pronounced directly. The expansion of the case reached even international journalists and academics, who began to analyze it as a paradigmatic example of how censorship can transform a private tragedy into a global phenomenon. For them, the magnitude of the public response was not a simple result of the mystery, but the manifestation of a deep desire to question power structures perceived as immovable. The reports mentioned the so-called Fang effect, a term that referred to the way in which the absence of information generates creative interpretations that multiply beyond institutional control. In the midst of this wave of analysis, Yang Mi's silence continued to stand out as a central element. Every day without statements added a new layer of ambiguity. Her absence was no longer interpreted solely as a sign of fear, but as a form of involuntary resistance. The public perceived her as a figure trapped between her own public image and the invisible pressures of a system that seemed to extend beyond any predictable logic. The actress, without pronouncing a single word, had become a symbol representing both fragility and strength. The story reached its turning point when an anonymous documentary began to circulate, attempting to reconstruct the emotional evolution of the case. Without narration or interviews, it only showed images. Fang smiling on a film set, Yang Mi in silence behind the scenes, improvised vigils in various cities, and fragments of deleted posts. At the end, a phrase slowly faded over a black background. When the truth is forbidden, stories become sacred. The piece lasted only a few minutes before being removed from the platforms where it appeared, but the effect was already marked. For those who saw it, the message was not a conclusion, but a confirmation that what the public had built over the months had a deeper purpose than any official explanation. The documentary reaffirmed something that was already intuited. The story had ceased to be a search for answers, to become a collective affirmation of memory. The case of Allen Fang, with its constellation of silences, signs, and fragmented testimonies, no longer responded solely to a desire to clarify the facts, but to the need to resist the symbolic disappearance that seemed to threaten him from the beginning. In this sense, the climax was not a discovery, but a shared realization. The certainty that the truth, although hidden, continues influencing every gesture that seeks to preserve it. The echo of Allen Fang's story did not die out with the end of the media storm. On the contrary, what remained afterward was an emotional landscape transformed by a newly awakened consciousness. His name ceased to be an isolated reference within the industry to become a symbol that transcended borders. Where before there was a young actor admired for his serenity, now exists a figure that embodies the price that fame can come to charge when it finds itself trapped between the rigidity of control and imposed silence. The memory of Fang transformed into a permanent reminder that even the most brilliant stories can be vulnerable to forces that operate beyond the public view. Young Mi, for her part, continued to be a silent presence whose influence was strengthened precisely by that absence. More than the involuntary protagonist of a rumor, she became a representation of the fragility of the human being in the face of a system that demands perfection, discipline, and discretion at any cost. Her figure was interpreted as a mirror, reflecting collective fears, the possibility that even someone with consolidated prestige can be reached by dynamics they do not control. Her silence, far from diluting the story, endowed it with a depth that invited reflection on what it means to exist under constant surveillance. As the case settled in public memory, a broader understanding of the phenomenon arose. The conversation no longer revolved solely around what occurred, but around what it revealed about the relationship between power, truth, and narrative. The public began to consider the story as a reminder that transparency is not a luxury, but a vital necessity. Where the truth is restricted, memory becomes a form of resistance that prevents a life from being reduced to administrative silence. The vigils, the ephemeral documentaries, and the messages that survived censorship showed that there existed a deep desire to preserve the human bond that had formed during the months of uncertainty. It was not just about honoring Fang, but about reaffirming the importance of keeping alive any story that has been threatened by oblivion. The global community that emerged around the case demonstrated that solidarity can emerge even from the darkest cracks, and that, on occasions, the search for answers transforms into a search for meaning. The most powerful legacy of this story resides in the lesson it left. The fragility of fame is not an exclusive warning for those who shine in front of the cameras, but for any society that delegates the truth to impenetrable structures. When information is fragmented or denied, the population not only loses clarity, it also loses the capacity to trust. In that void, imagination becomes an instrument, the community becomes a refuge, and memory transforms into a force that challenges disappearance. The case of Alan Fang reminds us that even in a world where every light is monitored and every word is susceptible to being erased, the need to understand persists as an undeniable human impulse. The truth may take time to emerge, it may be seen as distorted, or no longer possess the concrete form that was expected. But the collective will to face the unknown keeps alive that which silence attempts to dissipate. Because, in the end, the light that endures is not the one that dazzles, but the one that refuses to be extinguished. And as long as there exists someone willing to remember, no story is truly lost.